Sarah's fingers trembled as she folded the last of her clothes into the worn suitcase. The small room that had been her sanctuary for 18 years felt smaller now, the familiar walls seeming to close in on her. Through the thin window, she could see her mother pacing in the garden below, her shoulders hunched with the weight of decisions that had already been made. The arrangement had been discussed in hushed tones for months. Sarah caught fragments of conversations between her parents when they thought she was sleeping. Words like secure future and good family floated through the walls, but the full picture remained hidden from her until 3 days ago, when her father sat her down at the kitchen table. "The Mitchell family has agreed to take you in," he had said, his voice steady but his eyes avoiding hers. "Thomas Mitchell lost his wife 2 years ago. He has 2 children who need care and you need a stable home." Sarah had stared at him confused. "But this is my home." Her father's face had crumpled then just for a moment before he composed himself. "We can't provide for you anymore, Sarah. The factory closed last month. This is the best option for everyone." Now, as she zipped the suitcase closed, Sarah wondered what everyone really meant. She had never met Thomas Mitchell, though she knew of him from church. He was a quiet man who sat in the back pews with his 2 young children, a boy and a girl who couldn't be more than 8 and 10 years old. His wife had died in a car accident, leaving him to raise them alone while managing his small farm on the outskirts of town. The sound of a car engine made Sarah's heart race. She pressed her face to the window and saw a dust-covered pickup truck pulling into their driveway. Thomas Mitchell stepped out, his tall frame casting a long shadow in the afternoon sun. He wore clean work clothes and carried himself with the careful dignity of a man who had learned to shoulder burdens alone. Sarah's mother appeared at the bedroom door, her eyes red from crying. "It's time, sweetheart." The walk downstairs felt endless. Sarah's legs moved mechanically while her mind raced with questions she hadn't dared to ask. What would be expected of her in this new household? Would she be treated as family or as help? The distinction seemed important, though she couldn't quite articulate why. Thomas Mitchell stood in their small living room, hat in hand, speaking quietly with her father. When Sarah entered, both men turned to look at her. Thomas's eyes were kind but tired, the lines around them speaking of sleepless nights and heavy responsibilities. "Miss Sarah," he said, nodding politely, "I hope you'll find our home comfortable." His voice was gentler than she had expected, carrying a soft drawl that suggested careful thought behind each word. Sarah managed a small nod in response, not trusting her voice to remain steady. Her mother pressed a small cloth bundle into her hands. "Your grandmother's Bible and some letters from your aunt," she whispered. "Keep them close." The goodbye was brief and awkward, full of things that couldn't be said in front of Thomas Mitchell. Sarah hugged her parents, breathing in the familiar scents of her mother's lavender soap and her father's pipe tobacco, trying to memorize them. The truck ride to the Mitchell farm passed in relative silence. Thomas made a few attempts at conversation, asking about her schooling and whether she had experience with household tasks. Sarah answered politely but found herself studying his profile as he drove. There was something deeply sad about him, a heaviness that seemed to weigh down his shoulders even when he smiled. "My children are good kids," he said, as they turned onto a dirt road lined with oak trees. "Emma is 10 and Billy just turned 8. They've been without a mother's influence for too long. I do my best, but there are things a man can't teach, can't understand." Sarah nodded, beginning to understand her role more clearly. She wasn't just moving into a new home. She was stepping into a space left empty by tragedy, expected to fill needs she wasn't sure she knew how to meet. The Mitchell farmhouse appeared through the trees, a 2-story white building with a wraparound porch and green shutters. It was larger than her family's home, though it showed signs of being maintained by someone with limited time. The garden was overgrown and paint peeled from the porch railings. 2 small faces appeared at an upstairs window as the truck pulled up. Emma and Billy Mitchell watched with curious eyes as their father helped Sarah with her suitcase. She waved tentatively, and after a moment Emma waved back. Inside, the house felt like a museum of interrupted life. Family photographs lined the mantelpiece, most featuring a beautiful woman with dark hair and a bright smile. Thomas's late wife was everywhere and nowhere, her presence felt in the carefully maintained rooms and her absence obvious in the dust that had settled on surfaces too high for the children to reach. "This will be your room," Thomas said, leading Sarah to a small but pleasant space on the 2nd floor. It was my wife's sewing room, but we cleared it out for you. The room smelled faintly of lavender and old fabric. A single bed sat against one wall, covered with a quilt that looked handmade. A small desk by the window would give her a place to write letters home. Though she wondered how often she would be allowed that luxury, Emma and Billy appeared in the doorway, still shy but clearly curious about this new addition to their household. Emma clutched a worn doll while Billy held what appeared to be a carved wooden horse. "Children, come say hello properly," Thomas encouraged gently. Emma stepped forward first, her dark eyes serious. "Are you going to take care of us now?" The question held more weight than a 10-year-old should have to carry. Sarah knelt down to Emma's level, meeting her gaze directly. "I'm going to do my best to help," she said honestly. "Maybe we can take care of each other." Billy smiled at this, stepping closer. "Do you know how to make pancakes?" "Mama used to make them on Sundays." Sarah's heart clenched at the hope in his voice. "I do know how to make pancakes. Maybe we can make some together soon." As evening fell, Sarah helped prepare a simple dinner while Thomas tended to the evening chores. The children chattered more freely now, telling her about their school, their friends, and their memories of their mother. Emma was the more serious of the two, clearly having taken on responsibilities beyond her years. Billy was still young enough to openly crave the attention and affection that had been missing from his life. That night, as Sarah lay in her new bed listening to the unfamiliar sounds of the farmhouse settling around her, she realized that her own innocence about the world was about to be tested in ways she hadn't anticipated. She was no longer just Sarah, the protected daughter of struggling parents. She was now part of a broken family that needed healing, caretaker to children who had lost too much, and something she couldn't yet define to a man who carried grief like a second skin. The hidden reality she sensed lurking beneath the surface of this arrangement would soon reveal itself, changing everything she thought she understood about her new life. The first month at the Mitchell farm passed like a carefully choreographed dance where everyone was still learning the steps. Sarah threw herself into the routines of her new life with determined energy, rising before dawn to help with breakfast and staying up late to mend clothes by lamplight. She told herself that staying busy would keep the homesickness at bay, but late at night, she often found herself staring out her bedroom window toward the direction of her family's house, wondering if they thought of her. Emma and Billy had accepted her presence with the adaptability of children, though Sarah noticed that Emma watched her with careful eyes, as if testing whether this new person in their lives would stay or disappear like their mother had. Billy was more open, climbing into Sarah's lap during story time and asking endless questions about where she came from and whether she had ever had pets. Thomas remained polite but distant, speaking to her mainly about household matters and the children's needs. He left for work on the farm before sunrise and often didn't return until after the children were in bed. Sarah began to understand that he was deliberately avoiding being alone with her, though she couldn't determine whether this was out of respect for her position in the household or something else entirely. It was on a rainy Thursday evening that the first crack appeared in the careful boundaries they had all established. Sarah was in the kitchen, kneading dough for the next day's bread, when Thomas came in earlier than usual, his clothes soaked from the storm that had blown in from the west. "Bad weather's coming," he said, hanging his wet coat by the door. "Might be a long night?" Sarah nodded, continuing to work the dough. She had grown comfortable with their brief exchanges, the practical conversations that kept the household running smoothly. But when she looked up, she found Thomas watching her with an expression she couldn't read. "You're good with them," he said suddenly. "The children? Better than I hoped. They're easy to love," Sarah replied honestly. "They just needed someone to pay attention to them." Thomas moved closer to the counter, and Sarah became acutely aware of his presence in the small kitchen. He was a large man, not just tall but broad-shouldered from years of farm work, and when he stood near her, she felt very young and very small. "You're different from what I expected," he said quietly. "More mature, more capable." Something in his tone made Sarah pause in her kneading. When she looked up at him, she saw something in his eyes that made her stomach flutter with unease. It wasn't entirely unpleasant, but it was definitely inappropriate. She was suddenly, uncomfortably aware that she was 18 years old and he was a lonely widower, and that the arrangement that had brought her here was more complex than anyone had explained to her. "Mr. Mitchell," she began, but he stepped back quickly, as if realizing he had crossed a line. "I should check on the animals," he said, grabbing his coat. Storm's getting worse. After he left, Sarah stood alone in the kitchen, her hands still covered in flour, trying to understand what had just happened. The feeling in her chest was strange, part fear, part curiosity, and something else she didn't have a name for. She had always known she was pretty. Boys at school had told her so often enough. But this was different. This was a man, not a boy. And the way he had looked at her suggested that he saw something in her that went beyond her usefulness as a caretaker for his children. The storm that night was fierce, with wind that howled around the farmhouse and rain that pelted the windows like thrown stones. Sarah lay awake listening to it, and to the sound of Thomas moving around downstairs. Once she heard his footsteps pause outside her door, and she held her breath until they moved on. The next morning brought sunshine and the pretense that nothing had changed, but Sarah felt a new awareness crackling in the air between them. Thomas was even more careful to avoid being alone with her, and Sarah found herself paying attention to things she had never noticed before. The way his hands looked when he reached for the coffee pot, the sound of his voice when he read bedtime stories to the children, the sadness that seemed to lift from his face when he smiled. Emma, with the keen perception of a child who had learned to read adult emotions for survival, seemed to sense the shift as well. She began staying closer to Sarah during the times when Thomas was around, as if positioning herself as a buffer. Sarah wondered what the little girl understood about the undercurrents swirling through their household. It was Billy who inadvertently forced the issue into the open. On a Saturday afternoon, while they were all in the garden picking vegetables for dinner, he looked up at Sarah with his innocent 8-year-old eyes and asked, "Are you going to marry Papa and be our real mama?" The question hung in the air like a bird caught in flight. Thomas froze, his hands still buried in the tomato plants, while Emma stared at her brother with a mixture of horror and curiosity. Sarah felt heat rise in her cheeks as she struggled to find an appropriate response. "Billy," Emma said sharply, "you can't just ask people things like that." "Why not?" Billy demanded. "Mrs. Henderson said that's what happens when ladies come to take care of children whose mamas died. She said Sarah's probably going to be our new mama." Sarah's heart sank as she realized that the whole town was watching their arrangement, with interest and making assumptions she hadn't considered. Mrs. Henderson was the biggest gossip in 3 counties, which meant that everyone was probably speculating about the exact nature of her presence in the Mitchell household. Thomas stood up slowly, brushing dirt from his hands. His face was carefully neutral, but Sarah could see the tension in his shoulders. "Mrs. Henderson doesn't know what she's talking about," he said firmly. "Miss Sarah is here to help us, nothing more." But even as he said it, Sarah caught him glancing at her with that same unreadable expression she had seen in the kitchen. She realized with a mixture of excitement and terror that the idea wasn't entirely unpleasant to him, and that Mrs. Henderson might not be as wrong as he claimed. That evening, after the children were in bed, Sarah and Thomas found themselves alone in the living room for the first time since the night of the storm. Thomas sat in his usual chair by the fireplace, while Sarah worked on mending one of Emma's dresses. The silence stretched between them, filled with things that couldn't be said. "I want you to know," Thomas said finally, "that I never intended, that is, when I agreed to take you in, it was purely for the children's sake." Sarah looked up from her sewing. "I know that. Do you?" He leaned forward, his elbows on his knees. "Because sometimes I wonder if the arrangement is fair to you. You're young, Sarah. You should be thinking about your own future, not taking care of someone else's children. Maybe taking care of your children is part of my future," she said quietly, surprised by her own boldness. Thomas stared at her for a long moment, and Sarah saw something shift in his expression. The careful distance he had been maintaining seemed to crack, just a little. "You don't know what you're saying," he said, but his voice was gentler than his words. "I know more than you think I do," Sarah replied. "I know that Emma has nightmares and climbs into my bed for comfort. I know that Billy still cries for his mother when he thinks no one is listening. I know that you work from dawn to dusk to avoid spending time in this house because it reminds you of everything you've lost." Thomas was quiet for so long that Sarah began to wonder if she had overstepped. But when he finally spoke, his voice was thick with emotion. "I also know," she continued softly, "that sometimes you look at me like you're seeing something you want, but don't think you deserve to have." The admission hung between them like a confession. Thomas stood up abruptly, pacing to the window. "You're 18 years old," he said, his back to her. I'm 32. I have 2 children and a farm that barely keeps us fed. I have nothing to offer someone like you. You have everything I want, Sarah said simply. A home, a family, a place where I'm needed. When Thomas turned back to her, she saw something raw and vulnerable in his eyes that made her heart race. The hidden reality of their situation was finally beginning to surface, and Sarah realized that the arrangement her parents had made was about to become something entirely different from what anyone had intended. The weeks following their conversation in the living room brought a subtle but unmistakable shift in the dynamics of the Mitchell household. Thomas no longer avoided being alone with Sarah, though their interactions remained carefully appropriate. Instead, he began lingering over morning coffee, asking her opinion about decisions regarding the children, and including her in conversations about the farm's future. Sarah found herself looking forward to these moments with an intensity that both thrilled and frightened her. Emma, ever perceptive, seemed to approve of the change. She began referring to Sarah as almost Mama when she thought no one was listening, and started asking questions about weddings and white dresses that made Sarah's cheeks burn. Billy, meanwhile, had decided that Sarah was already part of the family and treated the possibility of her becoming their stepmother as an established fact rather than a question. The turning point came on a warm Sunday evening in late September. Sarah was in the garden, gathering the last of the season's herbs for drying, when she heard raised voices coming from the direction of the road. She looked up to see her father's familiar figure walking up the drive. His face set in hard lines she recognized as trouble. Thomas emerged from the barn, wiping his hands on a rag, and the 2 men met in the yard. Sarah crept closer, staying hidden behind the large oak tree that dominated the garden, straining to hear their conversation. "I've heard talk in town," her father was saying, his voice tight with anger. "People are saying things about my daughter that I don't like." "What kind of things?" Thomas asked, his tone carefully neutral. "You know exactly what kind of things. Mrs. Henderson has been spreading stories about inappropriate arrangements and young girls being taken advantage of. She's saying you're planning to marry Sarah, that this whole situation is just a way for you to get yourself a young wife without the bother of proper courtship." Sarah's heart hammered against her ribs as she waited for Thomas's response. When it came, it was quiet but firm. "Mrs. Henderson should mind her own business. But for what it's worth, my intentions toward your daughter are completely honorable." "Your intentions?" Her father's voice rose. "She's 18 years old, Thomas. She's barely more than a child. I sent her here to help with your children, not to become your wife." "And what if she wants to become my wife?" Thomas asked. "What if we found something good here, something that helps all of us heal?" Sarah pressed her hand to her mouth to stifle a gasp. He was defending her, defending them, in a way that made her heart soar even as her father's reaction filled her with dread. "She doesn't know what she wants," her father snapped. "She's been sheltered her whole life. She has no experience with men, no understanding of what marriage really means. You're taking advantage of her innocence." "I would never take advantage of Sarah," Thomas replied, and there was steel in his voice now. "I love her, and I believe she loves me, though we've never spoken the words aloud. What we have is real, built on respect and genuine affection. It's not the desperate arrangement you're making it sound like." Sarah's legs went weak at the word love. She had hoped, dreamed even, but hearing him say it to her father made it suddenly, impossibly real. "Love?" Her father laughed bitterly. "You've known her for 2 months. You're lonely, and she's convenient. Don't dress it up as something it's not." "Don't tell me what I feel," Thomas said, his voice dangerously quiet. "I loved my wife deeply, and I know what love feels like. What I feel for Sarah is different, but just as real. She's brought light back into this house, hope back into my children's lives. She's made us a family again." "She's made you a family because that's what she was supposed to do," her father shot back. "But she's not your wife, Thomas. She's a girl doing the job we sent her here to do, and I'm taking her home before this situation gets any more out of hand." Sarah's blood turned to ice. She stepped out from behind the tree without thinking, her movements drawing both men's attention. "Papa," she said, her voice surprisingly steady despite the turmoil in her chest. "I'm not going home." Her father's face went red. "Sarah, you don't understand what you're saying. This man has filled your head with romantic nonsense. You're too young to make this kind of decision." "I'm old enough to know my own heart," Sarah replied, moving to stand beside Thomas. She could feel the warmth radiating from his body. could sense his surprise at her sudden appearance and bold words. "I'm old enough to know that this is where I belong." "You belong with your family," her father insisted. "With people who love you without expecting anything in return." "Thomas and the children are my family now," Sarah said, reaching for Thomas's hand. His fingers closed around hers, strong and calloused and reassuring. "And they do love me without expecting anything in return. Just like I love them." Her father stared at their joined hands as if they represented everything wrong with the world. "You're making a mistake, Sarah. A mistake you'll regret for the rest of your life." "The only mistake I would make is leaving," Sarah said firmly. "I've found something here that I never had at home. I found purpose and love in a place where I'm truly needed." Thomas squeezed her hand gently. "Sir," he said to her father, "I understand your concerns, but Sarah is legally an adult and she's made her choice freely. I promise you that I will cherish her, protect her, and provide for her to the best of my ability." "And if she changes her mind?" her father demanded. "When she realizes what she's given up, what then?" "Then I'll help her find her way to whatever makes her happy," Thomas replied without hesitation. "Even if it means letting her go?" Sarah felt tears prick her eyes at the selfless love in his words. This was exactly why she had fallen for him, not just his kindness to his children or his gentle strength, but his willingness to put her happiness before his own desires. Her father seemed to deflate slightly, recognizing the sincerity in Thomas's voice, but his face remained hard with disapproval. "If you go through with this," he said to Sarah, "don't expect to come running home when it falls apart. You're choosing them over your own family, and that has consequences." The words hit Sarah like a physical blow, but she kept her chin up. "I understand, Papa. I'm sorry you can't support my decision, but I won't change my mind." Her father turned and walked away without another word, his back rigid with anger and disappointment. Sarah watched him go, feeling a piece of her heart break even as the rest of it soared with the knowledge that Thomas loved her. When the sound of her father's footsteps had faded, Thomas turned to her, his eyes searching her face. "Do you mean it?" he asked softly. "Do you really want to stay, knowing what it will cost you?" Sarah reached up to touch his cheek, marveling at her own boldness. "I mean every word. I love you, Thomas. I love Emma and Billy. I love the life we're building together. Nothing my father said changes that." Thomas pulled her into his arms then, holding her close as the last light of day faded around them. Sarah breathed in the scent of him, soap and hay and something uniquely male that made her feel safe and excited all at once. "We'll have to be married soon," he murmured against her hair. "The town is already talking, and after today the talk will only get worse." "How soon?" Sarah asked, surprising herself with her eagerness. "As soon as possible," Thomas replied, pulling back to look at her. "Unless you want a big ceremony, flowers, all the things most girls dream of." Sarah shook her head. "I just want to be your wife. Everything else is just decoration." As they walked back toward the house together, Sarah realized that the hidden reality of her situation was finally coming into full view. What had started as a practical arrangement to care for two motherless children was becoming something beautiful and profound, a love story born from necessity but nurtured by genuine affection and mutual respect. The girl who had left her family's house 2 months ago was gone forever, replaced by a young woman ready to fight for the life and love she had found in the most unexpected place. The wedding took place on a crisp October morning, just 3 weeks after Sarah's confrontation with her father. It was a simple ceremony in the small church where Thomas had sat alone with his children for 2 years, but to Sarah, it felt like the most magnificent celebration in the world. She wore her mother's wedding dress, altered by Emma's eager but inexperienced hands, and carried wildflowers that Billy had picked for her at dawn. Emma served as her only attendant, serious and proud in her responsibility, while Billy stood beside his father as the best man, barely containing his excitement. The congregation was small, a few neighbors, Thomas's brother who had traveled from the next county, and the pastor's family. Notably absent were Sarah's parents, though she had sent them an invitation with a hopeful heart. As Sarah walked down the aisle, her eyes fixed on Thomas's face, she felt a peace settle over her that she had never experienced before. This was right. This was where she belonged. When Thomas took her hands in his and spoke his vows, his voice steady and sure, Sarah knew that whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together. The kiss that sealed their marriage was gentle, appropriate for the watching congregation, but it promised more intimate moments to come. Sarah's cheeks burned as she thought about the wedding night ahead, about sharing Thomas's bed as his wife, rather than simply living under his roof as a helper. The reception was held at the farmhouse, with tables set up in the yard and food prepared by the neighboring women who had finally decided to accept Sarah as one of their own. Mrs. Henderson was notably absent, but Sarah found she didn't care. She was too happy to worry about one bitter woman's disapproval. Emma and Billy were beside themselves with joy, finally having the mother they had been hoping for officially installed in their lives. Emma kept touching Sarah's wedding ring when she thought no one was looking, as if to reassure herself that it was real. Billy had taken to calling her Mama Sarah, and seemed determined to tell everyone who would listen about his new mother. As the sun began to set and the last of the guests departed, Sarah found herself alone with her new family for the first time as Thomas's wife. The children had been bathed and put to bed, exhausted by the excitement of the day, and Sarah stood in the kitchen cleaning up the last of the dishes, her wedding dress carefully hung away and replaced with a simple blue dress that Thomas had told her was beautiful. "Let me help with those," Thomas said, appearing beside her with a dish towel. "They're almost finished," Sarah replied, suddenly shy now that they were truly alone as husband and wife. Thomas took the plate from her hands and set it aside, then turned her to face him. In the soft lamplight, his face looked younger, the lines of worry and grief that had marked him when she first arrived softened by happiness. "Are you nervous?" he asked gently, reading her expression with the intuition that had developed between them over the past months. Sarah nodded honestly. "A little." "Are you?" Thomas smiled. "More than a little. It's been a long time since I've been anyone's husband. I want to do right by you, Sarah. I want to make you happy." "You do make me happy," Sarah assured him, reaching up to touch his face. "Every day, just by being yourself." Thomas caught her hand and pressed it to his cheek. "I never thought I would feel this way again. After Maria died, I believed that part of my life was over. You've given me a second chance at love, at happiness. I don't take that lightly." The mention of his first wife might have made another woman jealous, but Sarah felt only gratitude for the woman who had taught Thomas how to love deeply and faithfully. That capacity for devotion was part of what had drawn her to him. "I'm not trying to replace her," Sarah said softly. "I just want to build something new with you." "I know," Thomas replied, "and that's exactly what we're doing." When he kissed her this time, it was different from the chaste kiss they had shared at the altar. This kiss spoke of promises and possibilities, of the intimate bond they were creating as husband and wife. Sarah felt herself melting into him, her nervousness giving way to excitement and anticipation. "Come," Thomas said, taking her hand. "Let me show you our room." Sarah had been sleeping in the small sewing room since her arrival, but now she would share the master bedroom with Thomas. He had spent the previous week preparing it, removing the most personal reminders of his first marriage while keeping the furniture and decorations that made the space comfortable and welcoming. The room was larger than anywhere Sarah had ever slept, with a big four-poster bed covered in quilts that Maria had made during the early years of her marriage. Thomas had explained that he wanted to keep them, that they represented the happiness he had once known, rather than the sadness of loss, and Sarah had understood completely. "It's beautiful," Sarah said, looking around at the space that would now be theirs together. "Are you sure you're ready for this?" Thomas asked, his hands resting gently on her shoulders. "We can wait if you need more time. There's no rush." Sarah turned in his arms, looking up into his concerned face. "I've been ready since the night you told my father you loved me. I've been ready since I realized that what I felt for you was more than gratitude or affection." Thomas's eyes darkened with emotion. "What do you feel for me, Sarah?" "I love you," she said simply. "I love your kindness and your strength. I love how patient you are with the children, how hard you work to provide for us. I love the way you look at me like I'm something precious. I love the man you are, and I want to be your wife in every way that matters." The honesty in her words seemed to break down the last of Thomas's restraint. He pulled her close, kissing her with a passion that made her knees weak and her heart race. Sarah had never been kissed like this before, had never felt the stirring of desire that spread through her body like warm honey. When they finally broke apart, Both breathing hard, Thomas rested his forehead against hers. "I'll be gentle," he promised. "I'll take care of you." "I know you will," Sarah whispered back. "I trust you completely." Later, as Sarah lay in her husband's arms, her head resting on his chest, she marveled at how natural it felt to be there. The physical intimacy had been overwhelming at first, a mixture of nervousness and wonder, but Thomas had been patient and tender, guiding her through the experience with a gentleness that made her love him even more. "No regrets?" Thomas asked softly, his fingers stroking through her hair. "None at all," Sarah replied, tilting her head to look at him. "Do you have any regrets?" "Only that I waited so long to tell you how I felt," Thomas said. "I wasted weeks trying to convince myself that what was happening between us was inappropriate, that I was taking advantage of your situation. I should have trusted that what we were building was real." Sarah propped herself up on her elbow to look down at him. "Maybe we both needed those weeks to be sure. I had to learn that I loved you as a man, not just as a father figure or a safe harbor. You had to learn that I was choosing you freely, not just accepting my circumstances." Thomas reached up to tuck a strand of hair behind her ear. "When did you become so wise?" "When I became your wife," Sarah replied with a smile. "When I realized that I was strong enough to fight for what I wanted, even if it meant disappointing people I loved." As they talked quietly in the darkness, Sarah thought about the journey that had brought her to this moment. 6 months ago, she had been a girl living in her parents' house with no clear idea of what her future might hold. Now she was a wife and stepmother, a woman who had chosen her own path, despite the opposition of those who claimed to know what was best for her. The hidden reality she had sensed when she first arrived at the Mitchell farm had finally revealed itself completely. What had appeared to be a practical arrangement had been something much deeper, an opportunity for healing, for love, for the creation of a new kind of family built on choice rather than obligation. The innocent girl who had been handed over to a heartbroken father had discovered her own strength, her own desires, and her own capacity for love. As sleep began to claim her, Sarah smiled to herself, thinking about the children sleeping peacefully down the hall who would wake up tomorrow with a real mother again, and about the man beside her who had taught her that love could grow from the most unexpected soil. They had all found something they hadn't known they were looking for, and now they had the rest of their lives to nurture it into something beautiful. Winter arrived early that year, blanketing the Mitchell farm in snow that sparkled like diamonds under the weak December sun. Sarah had never been happier, despite the isolation that came with the harsh weather. Being snowed in meant more time with her family, more evenings spent around the fireplace with Thomas reading aloud, while she mended clothes and the children played quietly nearby. Emma and Billy had adjusted to calling her Mama without any hesitation, and Sarah found that the title filled her with a fierce protective love she hadn't expected. When Emma came to her with scraped knees or hurt feelings, when Billy crawled into her lap seeking comfort after a nightmare, Sarah felt a completeness she had never imagined possible. But it was in January that Sarah began to suspect she was carrying a child of her own. The morning sickness started subtly, just a slight queasiness when she first woke up that she attributed to the heavy winter meals they had been eating. But as the days passed and the nausea grew stronger, accompanied by a bone-deep fatigue that made even simple tasks feel overwhelming, Sarah began to recognize the signs her mother had described when talking about her own pregnancies. The realization filled her with equal parts joy and terror. She and Thomas had never discussed having children together, though she had assumed it would happen eventually. Now, barely 3 months into their marriage, she was faced with the reality of becoming a mother to a child of her own, while still learning how to be a mother to Emma and Billy. She kept the secret for 2 weeks, wanting to be absolutely certain before she told Thomas. During that time, she found herself studying him when he interacted with the children, trying to imagine how he would react to the news of another baby. He was such a devoted father to Emma and Billy, patient and loving even when they tested his limits. But would he want another child? Would he see this pregnancy as a blessing or a burden? The decision of when to tell him was taken out of her hands on a snowy February morning, when she was suddenly and violently sick while preparing breakfast. Thomas found her in the kitchen, pale and shaking, clutching the edge of the counter for support. "Sarah, what's wrong?" he asked, immediately concerned, his hands gentle as he steadied her. "I'm fine," she managed, though her voice was weak. "Just something I ate, I think." Thomas studied her face with the careful attention of a man who had learned to read his wife's moods and expressions. "This isn't the first time you've been sick in the mornings, is it?" Sarah met his eyes and saw understanding dawning there. She nodded slowly, unable to speak past the sudden tightness in her throat. "How long have you known?" Thomas asked softly, his hands moving to cup her face with infinite tenderness. 2 weeks, maybe 3. I wanted to be sure before I told you." Thomas was quiet for a long moment, his thumbs stroking across her cheekbones as he processed the news. Sarah held her breath, searching his expression for any sign of his reaction. "Are you happy about it?" she asked finally, unable to bear the silence any longer. Thomas's face broke into a smile so radiant that it took Sarah's breath away. "Happy? Sarah, I'm overjoyed. Another child, our child." He pulled her into his arms, holding her close but carefully as if she were made of spun glass. "I love you so much, and I already love this baby." The relief that flooded through Sarah was so intense it brought tears to her eyes. "I was afraid you might think it was too soon, that we already had enough responsibility with Emma and Billy." "There's no such thing as too much love in a family," Thomas said firmly. "This baby will be loved and wanted just like you are, just like Emma and Billy are." The children's reactions were everything Sarah could have hoped for. Emma, now 11 and increasingly interested in grown-up matters, was fascinated by the idea of having a baby in the house. She peppered Sarah with questions about when the baby would arrive, whether it would be a boy or girl, and what her responsibilities as a big sister would be. Billy, meanwhile, was simply excited about having someone smaller than him to look after and teach things to. As Sarah's pregnancy progressed, the entire family seemed to revolve around preparing for the new arrival. Thomas built a cradle during the long winter evenings, his hands careful and loving as he shaped each piece of wood. Emma helped Sarah sew tiny clothes and blankets, her stitches improving with each project. Billy collected smooth stones and pretty feathers to decorate the baby's room, certain that these treasures would be appreciated by his new sibling. But the pregnancy wasn't easy. Sarah, who had always been healthy and strong, found herself struggling with exhaustion and nausea that lasted well beyond the first few months. There were days when she could barely get out of bed, let alone manage the household and care for the children. Thomas took over more and more of the domestic responsibilities, rising even earlier to help with breakfast and staying up late to finish the laundry Sarah had been too tired to complete. Emma stepped up as well, taking on responsibilities that seemed beyond her years. She helped Billy with his lessons, prepared simple meals when Sarah was too sick to cook, and read bedtime stories when Sarah was too exhausted to keep her eyes open. Sarah watched her stepdaughter mature before her eyes, and felt both proud and guilty that circumstances were forcing Emma to grow up so quickly. It was during one of Sarah's difficult days, when she had been sick most of the morning and was lying down in the afternoon, that she overheard a conversation between Emma and Billy that broke her heart. "Is Mama Sarah going to die like our first mama did?" Billy asked, his voice small and frightened. "Don't be silly," Emma replied, but Sarah could hear the uncertainty in her voice. "Mama Sarah is just having a baby. That's different. But our first mama got sick too before she died, and Mama Sarah is sick a lot now." There was a long pause before Emma answered, and when she did, her voice was thick with tears. "I don't know, Billy. I hope not. But if something happens to her, we'll still have Papa, and we'll still have each other." Sarah lay in bed, tears streaming down her face, as she realized that her difficult pregnancy was reawakening the children's fears of abandonment. They had lost one mother already. The possibility of losing another was terrifying to them in ways she hadn't fully considered. That evening, after the children were in bed, Sarah told Thomas about the conversation she had overheard. His face grew grave as he listened, and she could see him struggling with his own fears about her health and the baby's. "Maybe we should send for the doctor from town," he said. "I know it's expensive, but if there's something wrong—" "There's nothing wrong," Sarah assured him, though she wasn't entirely certain herself. "Women have been having babies for thousands of years. I'm just having a harder time than some." "You're also younger than most women when they have their first child," Thomas pointed out, "and you've been working so hard taking care of all of us. Maybe you need more rest." Sarah knew he was right, but the idea of spending weeks in bed while her family struggled to manage without her felt selfish. She had come to the Mitchell farm to help, not to be a burden. "I'll be fine," she insisted, "and even if I'm not, even if something does happen, you have to promise me that you'll take care of Emma and Billy." They can't lose another mother, Thomas. They can't go through that again. Thomas pulled her close, his arms tightening around her. Nothing is going to happen to you, he said fiercely. I won't let it. We're going to get through this together. And our baby is going to be born healthy and strong, and our family is going to be perfect. Sarah wanted to believe him, but as she lay in his arms that night, feeling the baby move restlessly inside her, she couldn't shake the feeling that their happiness was too fragile, too new to be guaranteed. The hidden reality of her situation was revealing new layers of complexity, the physical demands of pregnancy, the emotional weight of motherhood, and the terrible vulnerability that came with loving people so deeply that losing them would be unbearable. But even with all her fears, as she felt Thomas's steady breathing beside her and heard the soft sounds of Emma and Billy sleeping peacefully in their rooms, Sarah knew that whatever challenges lay ahead, they had already created something beautiful and worth fighting for. The love that had grown from such unexpected beginnings had become the foundation of a family that could weather any storm, as long as they faced it together. Spring arrived with a burst of wildflowers and renewed hope, but it also brought unexpected visitors to the Mitchell farm. Sarah was hanging laundry on the line, her pregnancy now visible beneath her loosened dresses when she saw a familiar figure walking up the dirt road. Her heart leaped with joy and anxiety as she recognized her mother's determined stride. Margaret Stewart looked older than Sarah remembered, her face lined with worry and her hair more gray than brown. She carried a small carpet bag and wore her Sunday dress, as if the formality of her clothes could somehow bridge the months of silence that had stretched between them. "Mama," Sarah called out, dropping the wet sheet she had been hanging and running toward her mother as fast as her condition would allow. Margaret's stern expression crumbled when she saw her daughter, and she opened her arms just in time to catch Sarah as she threw herself into them. They held each other tightly, both crying, while months of hurt and longing dissolved in the warmth of reunion. "I'm sorry," Margaret whispered into Sarah's hair. "I'm so sorry for staying away, for letting pride keep me from my daughter." "I'm sorry too," Sarah sobbed. "I never wanted to choose between you and Thomas. I just needed you to understand." They were still embracing when Thomas appeared, having heard the commotion from the barn. He stopped at a respectful distance, unsure of his welcome, but clearly prepared to defend his wife if necessary. Margaret noticed him and slowly pulled away from Sarah, studying the man her daughter had chosen. "Mr. Mitchell," she said formally, though her voice lacked the hostility Sarah had feared. "Mrs. Stewart," Thomas replied with equal formality. "You're welcome in our home." Margaret's eyes swept over Sarah's rounded belly, and something shifted in her expression. "When is the baby due?" "Late summer," Sarah replied, unconsciously placing her hands over her stomach. "We're hoping for August." "Your first grandchild," Thomas added quietly, and Sarah saw something like vulnerability flash across his face. He wanted her mother's acceptance, she realized, not just for his own sake, but because he knew how much it would mean to Sarah. Margaret was quiet for a long moment, clearly wrestling with emotions she wasn't ready to voice. Finally, she looked back at Sarah. "May I stay for a few days? I'd like to see how you're managing. Help with the baby preparations if you'll have me." "Of course," Sarah said quickly, before Thomas could object. "We'd love to have you stay." The next few days were delicate as everyone learned to navigate the new dynamic. Margaret was polite but reserved with Thomas, clearly struggling to reconcile her disapproval of the marriage with the evidence of her daughter's happiness. She was warmer with Emma and Billy, who remembered her from church and were excited to have another grandmother figure in their lives. But it was Margaret's growing concern about Sarah's health that eventually broke down the barriers between her and Thomas. Sarah was having a particularly difficult day, unable to keep food down and so exhausted she could barely lift her head from the pillow. Margaret sat by her bedside, her face creased with worry. "She's too thin," Margaret said to Thomas when he came to check on Sarah. "And this exhaustion isn't normal. I had 4 children and I never felt this poorly." Thomas's face was grim. "I've been thinking the same thing. I wanted to send for the doctor weeks ago, but Sarah insists she's fine." "She's stubborn like her father," Margaret said with a slight smile. "But sometimes being stubborn isn't wise. This baby is taking too much from her." That evening, after Sarah had fallen into an exhausted sleep, Margaret and Thomas had their first real conversation. They sat in the kitchen, speaking in low voices while Emma and Billy did their lessons at the table. "I owe you an apology," Margaret said without preamble. "I let fear and prejudice cloud my judgment about your marriage." Thomas looked surprised. "You don't owe me anything, Mrs. Stewart. I understand why you were concerned." "But I was wrong," Margaret insisted. "I can see how much you love her, how well you care for her. And she's happier than I've ever seen her, even feeling as poorly as she does now." "I do love her," Thomas said simply. "More than I thought possible. And I'd do anything to make sure she and the baby are safe. Even if it means going against her wishes about the doctor." Thomas was quiet for a moment. "I've been thinking about that. If she gets any worse, I'm sending for him whether she agrees or not." "I won't lose her, Mrs. Stewart. I can't." Margaret reached across the table and covered his hand with hers. "Call me Margaret." "And you won't lose her. She's stronger than she looks, my Sarah. But you're right to be concerned. Sometimes women need protecting from their own stubbornness." The next morning brought a crisis that resolved the question of medical care once and for all. Sarah woke up with severe cramping and spotted bleeding that sent both Margaret and Thomas into action. While Thomas rode hard to town for the doctor, Margaret took charge of the household, keeping the children calm while monitoring Sarah's condition. Dr. Peterson arrived in the early afternoon, a kindly man in his 60s who had delivered most of the babies in the county. His examination of Sarah was thorough but gentle, and his face was serious when he emerged from the bedroom to speak with Thomas and Margaret. "The baby is fine," he said, holding up a hand as relief flooded their faces. "But Mrs. Mitchell is severely anemic and undernourished. Her body is struggling to support both herself and the child." "What can we do?" Thomas asked immediately. "Complete bed rest for the remainder of the pregnancy," Dr. Peterson said firmly. "Proper nutrition, iron supplements, and no stress or heavy work. If she follows these instructions exactly, both she and the baby should be fine. If she doesn't—" He left the sentence unfinished, but his meaning was clear. Margaret stayed for another month, helping to enforce the doctor's orders and taking over the household duties that Sarah had been struggling to manage. During those weeks, she and Thomas developed a genuine friendship built on their shared love for Sarah and concern for her well-being. She also grew closer to Emma and Billy, filling a grandmother role they had been missing. "I should go home soon," Margaret said one evening as she and Thomas sat on the porch after putting the children to bed. "Your hired help will be starting next week, and Sarah is stronger now." "You don't have to leave," Thomas said. "There's room for you here, and Sarah would love to have you stay through the birth." Margaret smiled. "You're a good man, Thomas Mitchell. I'm glad my daughter found you, even if it took me too long to see it. But my husband needs me at home, and you need to learn to be a family without me hovering over you." Before she left, Margaret had a private conversation with Sarah that they both knew was long overdue. "I was wrong to oppose your marriage," Margaret said, sitting on the edge of Sarah's bed. "I was so afraid of losing you that I couldn't see you were finding exactly what you needed." "You weren't entirely wrong," Sarah admitted. "I was young and naive about a lot of things, but I wasn't wrong about loving Thomas, about wanting this life." "No, you weren't," Margaret agreed. "And you've built something beautiful here. These children adore you. Your husband cherishes you, and you're about to have a baby with a man who will be a wonderful father. I'm proud of you, Sarah. Proud of the woman you've become." When Margaret left, it was with hugs and tears and promises to return for the birth. Sarah watched her mother's figure disappear down the road with mixed emotions. Sadness at seeing her go, but also a deep satisfaction that the rift between them had been healed. The remaining months of Sarah's pregnancy passed peacefully. Following the doctor's orders religiously, she gradually regained her strength while the baby grew healthy and strong inside her. Emma took pride in her role as head of household in Sarah's absence, while Billy appointed himself as the baby's protector, talking to Sarah's belly every night and bringing her flowers to make the baby happy. Thomas was transformed by the experience, becoming even more attentive and protective than before. He hired additional help for the farm and spent every free moment with his family, reading to Sarah, playing games with the children, and planning for their expanding household. As summer deepened and Sarah's due date approached, she reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. The innocent girl who had been handed over to a heartbroken father seemed like a different person now. In her place was a woman who had learned to fight for love, to build a family from broken pieces, and to find strength she never knew she possessed. The hidden reality of her situation had revealed itself layer by layer, first as an attraction that surprised them both, then as a love that challenged every assumption about appropriate arrangements, and finally as a partnership that had created something stronger and more beautiful than anyone could have predicted. Soon there would be a new baby to complete their family, a child born from the love that had grown in the most unexpected soil. Sarah could hardly wait to hold that baby in her arms and see the joy in Thomas's eyes as he became a father again, this time to a child that was theirs together from the very first breath. The baby came on a humid August evening when the air was thick with the promise of thunderstorms. Sarah had been feeling restless all day, unable to settle into any comfortable position, when the first real contraction hit her just as she was helping Emma prepare dinner. The pain was sharp and unmistakable, causing her to grip the kitchen counter and gasp. "Thomas," Emma called immediately, having been instructed on what to watch for. "It's time!" Within minutes, the household transformed into controlled chaos. Thomas sent Billy racing to the neighbors to fetch Mrs. Henderson, who, despite her earlier gossiping, had agreed to assist with the birth. Emma took charge of gathering the supplies they had prepared, while Thomas helped Sarah to the bedroom they had been preparing for weeks. Dr. Peterson arrived just as the sun was setting, painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and pink. He took one look at Sarah and nodded approvingly. "This baby is ready to meet the world," he said with a smile. "And you're doing beautifully, Mrs. Mitchell." The labor was long but not unusually difficult. Sarah found strength she didn't know she possessed, drawing on the same determination that had carried her through every challenge since arriving at the Mitchell farm. Thomas stayed by her side throughout, holding her hand, wiping her forehead with cool cloths and whispering words of encouragement and love. Emma and Billy waited downstairs with Mrs. Henderson, who had put aside her disapproval in the face of the miracle taking place upstairs. She kept the children busy with card games and stories, though Emma kept glancing toward the ceiling every time Sarah cried out. "Is she going to be okay?" Billy asked for the 10th time, his young face creased with worry. "Your mama is strong," Mrs. Henderson assured him, and there was genuine warmth in her voice. "And she's bringing you a little brother or sister. That's worth a bit of noise, don't you think?" Just after midnight, as the first rumbles of thunder began to roll across the farm, baby Grace Mitchell made her entrance into the world. She was perfect, tiny but healthy, with a powerful voice that announced her displeasure at being disturbed from her comfortable home. Dr. Peterson placed her in Sarah's arms, and the exhausted mother felt her heart expand in ways she hadn't known were possible. "She's beautiful," Thomas whispered, his voice thick with emotion as he traced one finger along his daughter's impossibly small hand. "She looks just like you." "She has your stubborn chin," Sarah replied with a tired laugh, unable to take her eyes off the miracle she held. When Emma and Billy were finally allowed upstairs to meet their new sister, their reactions were everything Sarah and Thomas could have hoped for. Emma approached with the reverence of someone witnessing something sacred, her eyes wide with wonder as she looked down at the baby. "She's so little," Emma whispered. "Can I touch her?" "Of course," Sarah said, guiding Emma's hand to rest gently on Grace's head. "You're her big sister. She's going to need you to teach her everything." Billy was less cautious, immediately climbing onto the bed for a closer look. "Why is she so red?" he asked with the blunt curiosity of an 8-year-old. "All babies are red when they're born," Thomas explained patiently. "She'll look more normal in a few days." "I think she's perfect the way she is," Billy declared loyally. "And I'm going to teach her how to catch frogs and climb trees." "When she's older," Sarah said with a smile. "For now, she just needs to eat and sleep and grow." The days following Grace's birth were some of the happiest of Sarah's life. She spent hours just watching her daughter sleep, marveling at the tiny fingers and toes, the way Grace's mouth moved as if she were dreaming of nursing, the perfect shell of her ears. Thomas was completely besotted, carrying Grace around the house whenever she was awake, talking to her about the farm, the animals, and all the things he would teach her when she was older. Emma threw herself into the role of big sister with characteristic seriousness, helping with diaper changes, bringing Sarah meals in bed, and singing lullabies she remembered from before her own mother died. Billy was gentler with the baby than anyone had expected, lowering his voice to whispers when she was sleeping and bringing her small gifts: smooth stones, pretty leaves, anything he thought she might like. Margaret arrived when Grace was 2 weeks old, having traveled as soon as she received word of the birth. Her joy at meeting her first grandchild was boundless, and she spent hours holding Grace, tears streaming down her face as she murmured prayers of gratitude. "She's perfect," Margaret kept saying, as if she couldn't quite believe it. "Absolutely perfect, she is, isn't she?" Sarah agreed, feeling a contentment so deep it was almost overwhelming. During Margaret's visit, Sarah's father finally made an appearance. He arrived quietly one afternoon, hat in hand, looking older and more uncertain than Sarah had ever seen him. The months of estrangement had clearly taken their toll on him, and when he saw Sarah with baby Grace in her arms, surrounded by her family, his composure cracked. "I'm sorry," he said simply, the words carrying the weight of all the hurt and pride that had kept him away. "I was wrong, Sarah, about everything." Sarah rose carefully, holding Grace close, and walked to her father. "You're here now," she said gently. "That's what matters." The reconciliation was emotional but healing, watched by Thomas and the children with relief and happiness. When Sarah placed Grace in her grandfather's arms, he looked down at the baby with wonder. "She's going to be beautiful like her mother," he said, his voice rough with emotion, "and strong like her father." "She's going to be loved," Sarah said firmly. "That's the most important thing." As autumn arrived and Grace grew from a tiny newborn into an alert, interactive baby, the Mitchell family settled into new rhythms that accommodated their youngest member. Sarah had never imagined how much joy a baby could bring to a household, how Grace's smiles and coos could light up even the most ordinary moments. Thomas proved to be just as devoted a father to Grace as he was to Emma and Billy, rising for nighttime feedings, walking the floors when she was fussy, and spending his evenings making faces to earn her delighted giggles. The children adored their baby sister, competing to make her laugh and fighting over who got to help with her care. On a crisp October evening, almost exactly a year after their wedding, Sarah and Thomas sat on the porch watching Emma and Billy play in the yard, while Grace napped in Sarah's arms. The farm looked prosperous and well-tended. The house glowed with lamplight and warmth, and the sound of children's laughter filled the air. "Do you ever think about how different things could have been?" Thomas asked, reaching over to stroke Grace's soft hair. "Sometimes," Sarah admitted, "but I can't imagine any other life now. This is exactly where I'm supposed to be." "Even knowing everything you've had to give up? The reconciliation with your parents came so late, and there were times when I worried the pregnancy might—" "Don't," Sarah interrupted gently. "We can't live in the land of what if. We can only live in what is, and what is beautiful." Thomas smiled and leaned over to kiss her forehead. "What is perfect." As they sat together in the gathering dusk, Sarah reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment. The innocent 18-year-old who had been handed over to a heartbroken father seemed like someone from another lifetime. In her place was a woman who had discovered her own strength, chosen her own path, and built a love that had transformed not just her own life but the lives of everyone around her. The hidden reality that had lurked beneath the surface of their practical arrangement had revealed itself to be the most beautiful truth of all, that love could grow from the most unexpected circumstances, that families could be built from broken pieces, and that sometimes the greatest courage was found in choosing love over safety, hope over fear. Grace stirred in her arms, opening dark eyes that were already beginning to show hints of Thomas's warm brown gaze. Sarah looked down at her daughter, living, proof of the love that had blossomed in this unlikely place, and felt overwhelmed with gratitude for every choice that had led her to this moment. Emma's laughter rang across the yard as Billy chased her around the oak tree, their joy infectious and pure. Thomas's hand found hers, strong and warm and reassuring. Grace made a soft cooing sound and settled deeper into sleep, trusting and content. This was her life now, full of ordinary moments that felt extraordinary because they were built on a foundation of authentic love and mutual choice. The girl who had arrived at the Mitchell farm with nothing but a suitcase and uncertain hopes had become a woman with everything that mattered. A husband who cherished her, children who needed her, and a baby who was the living symbol of their unconventional but beautiful beginning. The story that had started with necessity and developed through patience had become a love story for the ages, proof that sometimes the most meaningful journeys began with a single step into the unknown, guided by nothing more than hope and the courage to trust in the possibility of happiness.